All right. So hello, everyone, and a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, based on where you are. Welcome to the fourth 2022 Asia Society Korea's Youth Program session. Today, the topic in focus is on marginalization of youth, specifically why does marginalization have an impact on youth? And this is going to be facilitated by me, Regita. Before we begin with our session, I would, of course, like to introduce our very special, our very honorable mentor on board, Ambassador Joon Oh. And as Yoon had already given a brief discussion, I would just like to add on to that. Not only is Ambassador Joon Oh the board member of Asia Society Korea, he's also the professor of United Nations Studies at Kyunghee University in Seoul, Korea, the chair of Save the Children Korea, president of Korea's Council of Children Organization, and he has previously also served as ambassador and permanent representative of the Republic of Korea to the United Nations in New York from 2013 to 2016. And in that time, he was also the 71st president of the Economic and Social Council and the president of the Conference of State Parties to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2015-2016. So as you can tell from this very small bio of his, which does not do justice, of course, Ambassador Joon Oh is a very credible, very highly experienced person, and the best mentor we could get for this particular discussion that we have on board. So on behalf of all the fellows, I would like to welcome Ambassador Joon Oh. It is a pleasure and an honor to have you here with us. And so before we begin our discussion, we would be very grateful if Ambassador Joon Oh could kindly share a few words of wisdom, insights from his experience, from his, practical working experience working in this field. So Ambassador Joon Oh, if you could kindly share some words of wisdom.
Thank you very much, Regita. It's great to see all of you. I know that you are at different places in the world. Well, I like to say a few words by way of introducing myself. As Regita said, I used to be a Korean diplomat. I was a Korean ambassador to the United Nations. And after that, after I retired from the Foreign Service at the end of 2016, for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been working in civil society and also teaching at universities in Korea. But one of the things I'm focusing on is to work in the area of promotion of human rights. That is, when I was a UN ambassador, I think perhaps you already know that they say the United Nations is established on 3 pillars. 3 pillars meaning peace, development, and human rights. So when I was active as ambassador, I dealt with all these 3 issue areas, but by now, I try to focus on one area, which is human rights, because the non-governmental organizations I'm working with are mostly about children's rights, like Save the Children, or rights of persons with disabilities. In fact, I was in Busan earlier this week because the city of Busan in Korea is hosting a very big international disability conference next year, and I'm chair of the organizing committee. So like that, focusing on human rights, meaning children's rights, rights of persons with disabilities. Also, sometimes, of course, you have women's rights issues as well. And so I want you to think about human rights today, because what is human rights? Human rights are rights of human beings. So the Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. This is a very short sentence, but it is, I think it gives us very good maxim for the modern concept of human rights. Usually we say that modern concept of human rights came into being in the 18th century, and they were embodied in, for example, in the American Declaration of Independence or French Revolution, because they are different from any previous revolutions or change of power, because they are based on the concept that all human beings are equal. If you think about it, it's really a revolutionary concept. How come all human beings are equal? You know, if you are born to a king, you are a prince or princess. If you are born to a slave, you are also a slave. That has been the way for thousands of years. In any country in the world, you know, whether in Korea, whether in France, whether in UK, we all belong to a certain status. Humans are not born equal. Who says that? You know, why are humans equal? We are all different. We have different background. Some people have 2 arms. Some people have only 1 arm. Some people have colored skin, some people have fairer skin. So we are all different. But why do you say humans are all equal? That's a very important concept, and you need to think about it. The United Nations efforts to promote human rights as one of its 3 pillars have been focusing on 2 areas. One is to help people from human rights violations by states. You need to also think about states, because states are the most powerful institution humans have ever created. For example, you belong to school, you belong to church, you belong to family, but neither your school, nor your parents, nor your church can arrest you and execute you. But states can. Have you ever thought about it? Why do states have such strong power? I didn't give that kind of power to my state. I was just born and there were already laws and regulations. I never agreed to that. But if you don't abide by what your government say, then you can be imprisoned, you can be executed, you can be killed. You know, only states have that kind of power. So actually, when it comes to human rights, states are responsible to protect human rights of citizens. But at the same time, states are the most serious violator of human rights. Why? Because they are very powerful. Now think about Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews were killed by Nazi Germany. Think about Killing Field, in which 1.5 million Cambodians were killed by Khmer Rouge government, just because these people were loyal to the previous government. In the case of Holocaust, just because they are Jewish, no other reason. Can you think about any more serious human rights violations? All of these are committed by whom? By states. You know, there was a church in the United States some 30 years ago, which was a cult, And the pastor brought his followers to Guyana in South America and ask all of them to take poison with him so that they can all die and go to heaven. So 1,000 people died at one go. But if you think of it, it's only 1,000. Think of a Holocaust, 6 million. Think of a killing field, 1.5 million. That kind of massive human rights violations can only be committed by whom? States. So the United Nations, first area in which we want to protect human rights is by protecting people from human rights violations by states. For that, you need democracy. But not all the countries in the world are democracies. Right now, about 2/3 of all countries in the world are either democratic or partially democratic. But that's great progress because 30, 40 years ago, there was only half of them. Half of them were democratic at that time. But now we can say that 2/3 of countries in the world are democratic or partially democratic. And a good example is Korea, South Korea. 30 years ago, South Korea was not democratic. Now we are democratic. So that happened in other Asian countries like the Philippines, Indonesia. So as time goes by, we have more democracies in the world. And that helps. That helps in the sense that, we want to protect citizens from human rights violations by government, states, because states are the most serious violator of human rights. The second area where United Nations is trying to protect human rights is protection of vulnerable groups in society. In other words, you can call them social minorities. Who are social minorities? For example, women. Women, half of all the population in the world are women. But women are social minorities. Think about it. In 1865, in the United States, they abolished slavery. So colored people were also given freedom and rights. But that time, only colored men was given voting rights. When did women get voting rights in the United States? 1920. So 50 years later, white women, including white women, women got voting rights. Same in UK. British women got voting rights in 1919. So even though half of all the population are women are considered social minority because they have been discriminated in most of societies in the world for thousands of years. Children. We are all children at one point of our life. But when you grow up, when you become an adult, we seem to forget that. And we discriminate children because children are dependent on adults. They are weak. So we take advantage of children. So children are also social minority. Persons with disabilities. Some people are born with disability. Some people are born deaf. Some people are born with visual impairments. So people without disabilities, we discriminate them. So there are 9 human rights conventions in the United Nations, and most of them are about protecting human rights of social minorities. So, in a nutshell, the United Nations efforts to promote human rights are conducted in 2 areas: protecting citizens from human rights violations by states and protecting social minorities. So I will stop here, and if you have questions, or I can ask you questions as well. So please, Regita.
Yes, thank you so much, Ambassador, for your very profound insight on this very particular issue and the way you brought about human rights, the approaches to it, and also the power dynamic that you shared in a very historical as well as a global perspective was really insightful. I think this is definitely a great way to start our discussion as well, because we are focusing on trying to have a very intersectional understanding of like marginalization and also in the layered marginalization that you just at the moment shared with us. So if I could simply just give an overview of the session. So we are trying to unpack and understand marginalization and inequality facing youth worldwide through an intersectional lens and a wholesome discussion. And we also want to identify lessons learned and best practices, recommendations, and solutions that we could come up with to combat marginalization. So in this next 1.5 hours, we hope to be able to have a very dynamic discussion and definitely, again, have ambassadors' guidance and mentorship throughout. So for this particular topic, we divided because youth marginalization in itself and marginalization in itself is very complex and very big. So we wanted to make sure that our discussions were articulate. So we are trying to focus on 3 particular main challenges that are facing youth due to marginalization and discrimination. The first one is the exclusion of youth in governance and political participation. This particular topic will be presented by Valeria, and I will be taking in charge of the solution building Q&A, where we would have some questions for Ambassador, and Ambassador could also share his insights and if you have questions for us as well. The second main issue that we wanted to focus on was on gender and health marginalization, especially in conflict situations. And for this, Kit will be presenting and Vino will be taking over the solution building question answer. And the third main challenge that we wanted to focus on for today's discussion was the economic disenfranchisement and victimization of young people. For this, Ritu will be presenting and Mohammed will be taking over the Q&A question and answer. So to begin the session, I would like to ask Valeria to take over and present the first main challenge, that is the exclusion of youth in governance and political participation. Valeria, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Regita, for your introduction. The topic that I'm going to focus on, as she explained before, is exclusion of youth in governance and political participation. And I wanted to briefly talk about why it is important for youth to actively participate in governance and politics. For political systems to be representative, all parts of society must be included. When young people are disenfranchised or disengaged from political processes, a significant portion of the population has little or no voice or influence in decisions that affect group members' lives. A key consequence is the undermining of political systems' representativeness. To make a difference in the long term, it is essential that young people are engaged in formal political processes and have a say in formulating today's and tomorrow's politics. Inclusive political participation is not only a fundamental political and democratic right, but also is crucial to building a stable and peaceful societies and developing policies that respond to the specific needs of younger generations. For young people to adequately to be adequately represented in political institutions, processes, and decision-making, and in particular in elections, they must know their rights and be given the necessary knowledge and capacity to participate in a meaningful way at all levels. When there are obstacles to participate in formal, institutionalized political processes, young people can rapidly feel disempowered. Many tend to believe that their voices are not going to be heard or that they will be not taken seriously, even if they are heard. So the problem becomes circular as politicians may lose interest in responding to the aspirations of young people if they cannot win their votes. This in turn leads to young people being increasingly excluded from taking part in decision making or in debates about key socioeconomic and political issues, despite their sensitivity to the demands for social equity and justice, environmental protection, and cultural diversity, which are the main concerns in today's society. So I wanted to talk about what are the obstacles for youth participation in governance, and they can be divided into obstacles at a structural level, and the second one are the obstacles at individual level. In the obstacles at the structural level, the first issue is the age requirements to vote or run for office, as the first barrier for youth participation is the minimum voting age requirement set for national elections at 18 in most countries, which disenfranchises younger citizens. The second barrier for youth participation is the minimum age for eligibility to run for office, which is often set higher than the age to vote. Another obstacle is the age restriction in campaigning in some of the countries, as youth, which comprehends from 15 to 35 years old, encompasses minors with voting rights, minors with without voting rights, and young adults with voting rights. Some electoral laws penalize political parties who use minors for campaigning. It can be a challenge to both protect youth and encourage their participation at the same time. Another obstacle is the increased cost for candidate nomination and campaigning, and the lack of political finance regulations make it even more difficult for youth to start a political career. Also, if parties are not giving financial support to youth, to young candidates at the same time, at the same rates as for older candidates, they might feel disadvantaged. Another obstacle is the social and cultural traditions. As in most societies, politics have been for centuries a domain of older, often male and wealthy citizens, a situation that has resulted in the systematic exclusion of young people from political debates and decision making, and thus contributed to the underrepresentation of youth. Another obstacle that youth face in political participation is young women, as they are, in many countries, they are subjected to double discrimination based on their age and gender. And they also often experience additional obstacles compared with men because of social conventions and our insecure or unsafe environment. Women are still facing serious barriers to get registered as voters and to cast their votes. About the obstacles, individual level, some of them, one of the main obstacles is the distrust in political institutions. As a growing number of citizens, mostly young people, have little trust in formal political processes, political institutions, and leaders, perhaps because they feel they are not representative of their interest. Another obstacle is the lack of access to and knowledge about political processes. As young people are grappling with understanding the complexities of democratic societies and formal political processes. Actually, the UN 2016 Global Youth Report showed that nearly 53% of young college graduates say they always vote in national elections, in comparison with about 44% of all 18 to 29 years old. Other groups that are likely to lack the required knowledge to participate are marginalized youth, such as minorities, unemployed youth, and those living in isolation and or poverty. So a weak understanding of democratic principles and electoral processes make it more difficult for youth to perceive elections as routes to express their grievances, demand change, and hold governments accountable. Another obstacle might be the social and economic exclusion, marginalization. Also search about the possible solutions that could be taken into consideration in order to increase youth participation, and it can be divided into two. The first is the formal participation, mostly on a personal level, such as voting, being a member of a political party and joining youth wings, standing as a candidate at an election for a political position, being part of election administration, such as political polling official, and also observing elections. Participation of young people in formal political and electoral processes is relatively low compared to older citizens across the globe. However, a research in the UK has revealed that young people are no less committed to political processes than their parents' generation. However, they perceive a lack of genuine opportunities to take part in political life and feel alienated from formal public institutions. Instead, political engagement has also shifted to alternative realms like activist movements and protests or boycotts, as they are also still powerful channels for political expression, while the online sharing of views and information allows also young people to express their views and formulate demands for action and change outside of official structures and oversight. This shift from formal political engagement to informal or online engagement can reflect a sense on the part of young people that government and its institutions are run by professional elites who have little sense of or interest in the concerns of the youth. So another aspect of the solutions that I've researched on is the participation beyond the formal electoral processes. So beyond the formal political and electoral processes and structures, there are a number of ways young people can be actively involved in decision-making processes and institutions that affect their environment and their lives within it. These include structures that enable you to provide inputs and influence policy-making processes and structures that enable you to learn about policy-making processes, such as, for example, the national youth councils, youth parliaments in a local, national, and regional and international level. Local processes that feed into policy-making processes like youth majors, forums, peace processes, participatory or structured social dialogues in youth observatories, participatory planning, monitoring and research, also youth consultations and panels, opinion polls, online surveys, consultations and petitions, and civil society organizations. Opportunities for young people to participate in political process depend largely on the political and cultural context. A democratic environment can be more favorable to participation in general. For the most part, promoting youth participation needs to be geared towards achieving levels relative to those of the rest of the population. Regarding this, I wanted to talk about one case study of how this mentioned solutions can be applied in real life and were applied in real life. And one is the Young People's Constitution in Iceland. In 2010, the Icelandic government appointed a constitutional council to work on revising the nation's constitution. So in order to ensure that young people's voices were heard as part of this process, the Icelandic Children's Ombudsman, the UNICEF Iceland, and the city of Reykjavik launched a program to gather young people's input on the constitution. The program used the country's existing network of youth councils and a strong tradition of youth participation to bring young people together to work on this project. As part of this recruitment process was made to ensure balanced and inclusive representation, including input from immigrant communities. So in order to ensure that young people participants were fully informed of the issues, and an educational phase was built in at the beginning of the participation process, and videos and other tools were developed and screened and shared in schools and workshops. As a result of the Young People's Constitution meetings and workshops, a report with recommendations was put forward to the Constitutional Council, and this included a recommendation that the new constitution should include an article specifically supporting children and young people's participation in the political process. The Council was impressed with the quality of youth engagement and recommendations and incorporated the article on youth participation in its recommended constitution. From this example, it can be seen that young people can enable governments to recruit a more diverse group of young people and can be particularly effective in building positive relationships with more marginalized groups of young people who may not feel comfortable taking part in formal structures such as young councils and who might have limited access to digital tools for online engagement. So such projects rely on youth and government officials with the necessary skills and ability to build up reciprocal trust, often in collaboration with civil society groups. So before launching such programs, governments, if we want to also apply this into other societies, and taking this as an example, before launching such programs, governments should carry out an initial research phase to ensure that the proposed projects reflect a genuine need on the part of the targeted group and that sufficient capacities exist to run the project effectively. And these projects should then be structured in a way to ensure that youth participation is meaningful. Young people must feel comfortable collaborating with facilitators such as governments, agents, academic researchers, or representatives of civil society organizations.
Yes.
And reassure that their views will be heard and taken seriously. That's all from my part.
Yes, thank you so much, Valeria, for a very detailed overview of like youth in politics and governance. And not only did you share like why is it important, you even gave a very good case study, and it's really commendable. Based on this particular subsection of politics and governance, I personally had a question for Ambassador. Since you're not only an ambassador and diplomat, but you're also a university professor, I was just like wondering, if, as a professor, you have certain ways, certain strategies that you're trying to incorporate in your syllabus to empower young people to be more active in political participation and governance?
Yes. Valeria's presentation was very interesting. But when it comes to the issue of mainstreaming youth, I suggest that you start with the definition of youth, because internationally, when it comes to human rights conventions, as I told you, there are 9 human rights conventions in the United Nations. We don't have any human rights convention on youth yet. Actually, we don't have any human rights convention on elderly yet either. But we have a human rights convention on children, because children are defined as all human beings below the age of 18. So age 18 internationally has importance because, all the countries in the world except the United States are state party to Convention on the Rights of Child. So if your domestic legislation does not have law prohibiting people below 18 from getting married, then it is called child marriage. You are violating the Convention on the Rights of Child. I know that there are still many countries that allow, especially girls, to get married even though they are not yet 18. So the reason why I say this is because sometimes the concept of youth is confused with the concept of children, because some children, like you are 16, 17, or 18, usually in our society we consider them as youth. In the United Nations has a youth forum where some people over 30 also participate. So sometimes we talk about people ranging from, late teens to their, early 30s. We call them youth. But if you think about it, Valeria talked about voting rights for youth. Different countries have different criteria for that. But most countries, I think, allow people who are older than 20 voting right. They have different criteria for example, for driving, for drinking alcohol, for marriage. Some countries have 19, 20, 21. So if the approaches should be different, if you think about all of this, for example, allowing the legal children who are below 18 to, reflect their voice in decision making, because no countries in the world allow people under 18 voting right. So they don't have any legal way of mainstreaming their voice. So people who are below 18 are different from, let's say, 24-year-old woman. 24-year-old woman in any country, I think, have voting right. And many countries, they can also have a right to be elected. So situation is different depending on how old you are. So when it comes to, because you guys are talking about mainstreaming youth, I like to advise you to, think about youth and children in a broader context. And I hope you understand why children are considered a social minority, whereas youth are not. But of course, mainstreaming youth is also very important. And as you said, in colleges, in schools, these issues are also discussed. And I agree with you that there should be more systematic and organizational efforts to mainstream youth.
Yes, thank you so much, Ambassador. And yeah, I think this very concept of defining youth in itself is a challenge, I think, at the moment, that does not really, because like in different institutes, even UN, for statistical purpose, their definition of youth, again, is people between the age of 15 and 24. And then when it comes to minorities, again, this context of legal rights, giving legal rights in different contexts can be confusing. However, I think it's important to have this dialogue and to be able to comprehensively discuss, like, how do we still mainstream, how can we mainstream young people into politics? Because at the later stage, of course, they do take over. So being empowered as a young person and even as a child would allow us to be able to be better leaders in the future. And so I think it's a very interesting conversation. I just wanted to know if anybody else had any questions to Valeria, to Ambassador, or any contributions to this discussion that we're having so far. If not, we could move on with the second one. And of course, we could have a very interesting discussion at the end of the session as well. So for the second topic, second main challenge that we're trying to look into, it's the gender and health marginalization, especially youth rights in conflict situations. So for that, I'd like to hand over the platform to Keith.
Vinu and I are talking about health as a human right. So given the discussions surrounding the FIFA World Cup in Qatar and the mass shooting that was just present in the US, we decided to focus our discussion around the LGBTQ2IA+ community and focus on the right to bodily security. And we'll also input some gender dynamic as well. So following the discussion of LGBTQ+ rights in Qatar, people have once again been asking when queer folks are finally going to be able to exist safely within public spaces without the threat of bodily harm. Even in non-conflict zones, a case can be made for a war, quote unquote, against queer people. The right to safety, security, and even life are often not afforded to queer individuals all around the world, where youth often bear the brunt of this weight. Specifically in conflict, the most vulnerable become more marginalized, and the systems that are protecting them deteriorate. So weakened institutions, poverty, and migration resulting from armed conflict often leads to abuse, exploitation, and violence, particularly to young women and queer people. So regarding conflict, 90% of all deaths are attributed to young adult males in direct conflict. And likewise, 14 million youth were displaced because of direct conflict in 2011, but that number has only risen since. In regions of conflict, young women are at high risk of being killed by their partners because the cycle of violence flows downwards. Sexual exploitation and physical violence are often committed as weapons of war. For an example, one of the most famous examples of this is the Korean comfort women during the Japanese occupation. So continuing on from that, we have the statistics of 1 in 3 women will have experienced violent or sexual abuse throughout their lifetime, which is most often perpetrated by an intimate partner. And like I mentioned, that the statistic only rises in conflict zones and is, excuse me, and is exacerbated if you have intersecting identities, such as if you are queer. So women's bodies are highly stigmatized around the world. Many women around the world having inadequate access to proper medical attention, such as OB/GYN care. This factor is once again multiplied for social minorities who report higher rates of maternal death and or stillbirth and postpartum depression. The pink tax is something that you find all over the world, which raises the price of products targeted towards women, especially for menstrual hygiene, such as tampons and pads. Scotland has actually started offering free menstrual hygiene products as of a couple months ago, but is one of the only places in the world to do so. Menstrual cycles still remain highly stigmatized in many parts of the world and are seen as shameful and unclean. Regarding bodily autonomy, it's a huge uphill battle in most countries, where in some countries women must get a man's permission to perform certain medical procedures, and more often rights to abortion are limited or completely outlawed. So regarding queer youth, in countries where homosexuality is legal, most queer-focused spaces involve alcohol, clubs, bars, etc. And so the lack of sober queer spaces aside. This means that most safe spaces for LGBTQ2IA plus individuals are mostly populated by young people. So unfortunately, this means that the confluence of queer individuals in one space makes them an easier target for violent attacks. According to the CDC, 1 in 10 queer individuals reports having been denied medical care or attention by a provider or medical professional on the basis of moral or religious grounds. And this number is higher outside of the US. Regarding mental health, 40% of LGBTQ2IA plus individuals have reported considering suicide. 60% of all queer youth report having symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder. In many countries, HIV/AIDS discrimination is still widely rampant for queer individuals, especially for gay men, and they are often denied access to life-saving blood donations and transfusions for fear of tainted blood. This is despite the fact that HIV cases within straight populations outnumber that in queer populations and has been for years. Some countries will even deny you access to the country if they find out you are HIV positive. So in countries where gay marriage is still illegal, same-sex couples can oftentimes have limited access to spousal benefits such as visitation rights, medical information disclosure, and consent forms regarding hospital and visitation rights. So I actually jotted this down when Ambassador Joon Oh was talking regarding human rights, and it came to mind from a particularly personal experience that there is a major pushback from particularly Islamic countries claiming that the inclusion of LGBTQ2IA plus rights within international policy is a quote-unquote Western agenda, and that it is a Western interpretation of human rights, and that's why they push back against the International Declaration of Human Rights. And so, that all being said, this leads to a more general question that has been proposed on the internet in recent days following the mass shooting of individuals at a queer bar in the United States. Is there a human right to defend yourself, your rights, and your community? And so do minority communities such as queer individuals have the explicit dedicated right to take up arms to protect themselves from violent attacks when they are not protected by government regulations or law enforcement? And how does this impact arms control and gun regulation? I know under international law that there's a right to resistance. So, for example, the Palestinian people have the right to violently resist Israeli occupation because of the status of the occupation. And so I'm wondering, at what point does that resistance law apply to communities that are not officially within conflict? Like I mentioned before, a case could be made that there is a quote-unquote war against queer individuals. And so, yeah, that's the end of our presentation. We have some solutions we wanted to mention, but maybe we could go into the Q&A discussion first and then bring them up during the solution building Q&A.
Sure. Thank you so much. My first question would be to Ambassador Oh. I wanted to ask, like we discussed initially, how more countries in the world are progressing towards a more democratic system or giving more freedom to the individuals of the nation. There are times when freedom becomes a license. So having freedom for certain individuals means they can pose a threat to the freedom of the minorities or the marginalized people. So are there policies in place or are there ways in which we can ensure that just giving more freedom to individuals doesn't make them misuse this freedom to undermine the human rights for other marginalized communities?
Thank you, Reed. And also, thank you, Kit, for your presentation. You touched on various human rights issues. I like to say first, before answering Ritu's question, I like to say that, there are different levels of acceptance on human rights issues for different vulnerable groups. For example, earlier I mentioned that there are 9 human rights conventions in the United Nations. And the one that has the most number of state parties is CRC, Convention on the Rights of Child. It has 196 state parties. What does it mean? It means that it has more state parties than the entire membership of the United Nations. Actually, entire membership of the United Nations is 193. So, because the U.S. is not a state party, it means that there are 4 non-UN members who joined CRC. So, when it comes to rights of children, we can say that we almost have a consensus among all different countries or different peoples in the world. The second human rights convention that has many state parties is CEDAW. What is CEDAW? CEDAW is Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So when it comes to women's rights, we have something close to consensus. The third human rights convention is CRPD, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But other human rights conventions, like one on racial minority, another one on migrant workers, these conventions don't have too many state parties yet, even though they are older than CRPD, for example. So what does it mean? It means that we have different levels of acceptance on the rights of these vulnerable groups. So we don't yet have a human rights convention on LGBT. But I don't know if we can have one, but probably it will be quite difficult because in the United Nations, in the world, there are countries that have Muslim as their national religion, or even some Catholic countries don't agree. So probably it would be more difficult to have a human rights convention on minorities in sexual orientation. But of course, we do have international meetings and resolutions in the UN to advise to countries not to discriminate people on the basis of sexual orientation. So that's where we are. The United Nations is not asking member states to legalize same-sex marriage, but the United Nations is saying that you shouldn't discriminate people on the basis of their sexual orientation. As for Ritu's question, you use the word freedom, and actually, if you think about it, all these human rights issues, you can categorize them into 2 groups of human rights. One group is what is called political and civil rights. The other group is economic and social rights. So political and civil rights is about our freedoms, fundamental freedoms. We have freedom of speech, we have freedom of religion, we have freedom of assembly, we have freedom of movements. We all have these freedoms. And they are very important human rights. For that, to realize that kind of freedom, what we need is that the governments leave us alone. So we tell government, leave us alone. We have freedom. We can go to church. We can go to temple. We can live wherever we want to live. I can say whatever I want to say. So leave us alone. You see what is happening in China these days. People who demonstrated against government quarantine, they crack them down. So they don't leave them alone. So to realize our fundamental freedoms, the government should leave us alone. But what about the other group of human rights, economic and social rights? We ask the government to do something for us. It's not leave us alone. For example, we have a right to education. We have a right to health care. We have a right to social services. If the government leaves us alone, then there is no school. We cannot go to school, even though we have a right to education. If the government leaves us alone, we cannot realize our right to health care. There is no hospital. Only rich people can get health service. So the second group of human rights, economic and social rights, we ask government to do something actively so that we can realize our human rights. So when you said freedom of these minority, social minority individuals. So if you are talking about their political freedom, then the government should leave them alone. If we are talking about their right to education, healthcare, and other social benefits, then you should ask government to realize it.
Thank you so much for your answer, Ambassador. It really makes clear how we need to decide and discuss more on how the government should intervene and at what levels is government intervention necessary to ensure that the human rights for minorities are fulfilled. Apart from that, I also wanted to have a little discussion with all the other panelists that we have here. When Kit talked about how LGBTQIA plus community still doesn't have freedom to express their own identity, a lot of the times it's because sometimes they don't have a safe environment to do so. So do you have ways in which at the local level or at the level of the youth, we can create a more safer space for the people from the LGBTQIA plus community to express their identity freely? Anyone could go.
Yes, I'd like to go for this one because I'm actually right now in Vietnam attending the ILGA Asia conference. And so for those of you who don't know, ILGA Asia conference basically convenes we have more than 400 Asian LGBTQI human rights defenders, society, community-based organizations, government representatives here to raise awareness on pressing human rights issues against Asian LGBTQI communities. And we're also trying to create regional solidarity, come up with plans, strategies on the way forward for all of us. So I think this is one important thing, is that having a community is really important. Being able to increase the solidarity is really important, because oftentimes when we talk about human rights and even these conventions that were framed, I think many years ago, it's very fascinating to me how we box people into certain groups without realizing that people have intersectional identities, right? You could be a child, and you could be a queer child. You could be a child in poverty. Same with young people. You could be a woman, and you could be a queer women, you could be someone who's also a victim of sexual violence, or you could be a leader in different positions, of power as well. So the very fact that oftentimes when we are boxed into certain categories, even from these frameworks, in a way we neglect the intersectional issue that one faces because of one's identity. So I believe that when it comes to the marginalization of LGBTQI communities, it's very layered in a lot of ways, in a very structural as well as social manner as well. And hence, it's really important to have a discourse on it, because like even UN's theme is to leave no one behind, and leaving no one behind means acknowledging all the differences and trying to accommodate everyone, trying to create inclusive, safe space for everyone to be their best self. And I do agree with Ambassador when he mentioned that, it's not just a matter of like giving you all the rights per se like that. It's all just or like giving you all the freedoms. It's about the rights, like to be able to exercise your rights. And in that, of course, I think everyone in the individual level as well have to be accountable, have to hold that accountability to a great standard too, right? Because I can't just infringe somebody else's belief, somebody else's culture, somebody else's rights and freedoms too. But at the same time, to be given the same space to talk about it, to be yourself, is I think really important. And I feel that that solidarity can only start through dialogue, through discussions, and conferences like this that I'm attending right now, ILGA Asia, is one of the best ways to do that as well. This was actually hosted in Seoul, Korea in 2019 as well before. And so for you all as well, like you should definitely attend the next conference. We have a lot of diplomats, a lot of activists, advocates, leaders from different regions of Asia coming together to discuss from a very humanistic approach the lives, the experiences, the trials, the triumphs of the community. And I think this in itself is very empowering. And so when you talk about marginalization, it's important to bring that solidarity, intersectional approach to it as well.
Thank you so much for your answer, Regita. And definitely dialogue plays a very important role, because when you discuss things from your own perspective, you realize there is a lot of other things through other people's perspective, and that gives you a better understanding of what the world is currently and how you can have your own rights and exercise them in a better manner. So yes, that definitely helps. I would like to pass on the mic to Kit again to have some solutions that we've discussed and came up with that Ask Why could implement, and that could be implemented at the community level as well. So Kit, please.
Perfect. Just going off of what Regita said really quick, I think representation is very, very important as well. I think a lot of people have misconstrued ideas of what it means to be queer, what it means to be LGBTQ2IA, and that is something I've especially experienced with my boyfriend's partner, my boyfriend's parents. And part of it is that there's no representation of what it means to be queer in some of these communities. And, it's hard to get out there sometimes because you do put yourself in a very vulnerable position for, bodily security and safety. But, confronting people's ideas of what it means to be queer, what it means to be, part of this community, and they see, oh, you're just a normal person, just like me and you. You have, your identity is very complex. You have a career, you have a family, you have a dog, you have whatever, it's not as scary as they think it is. I think that's a huge part of that as well, which kind of leads us into the solutions we were thinking about. And so I know there is an anti-discrimination bill currently in process in Seoul. I'm not sure the current status of it currently, but I do think one of the things that ASK can do is unequivocally come out in favor of the anti-discrimination bill if they haven't already, which would both affect women as well as sexual minorities in terms of employment, in terms of, housing rights, medical rights, all of those kind of things. I think it's very important for things to be normalized and legalized by governments to ensure that no matter what problems these young people may face, they can get the adequate help and support they need, especially if we're talking about health services. Because a lot of young people will often hide their sexuality for fear of retribution or of shame. And so they have a whole bunch of undiagnosed issues or issues that they cannot face with medical attention. And so the legalization of this anti-discrimination law, as well as, coming out in support of gay marriage, for instance. I know that homosexual activity is already decriminalized within South Korea. And so, the normalization of status, I suppose, by the government will go a long way in decreasing the amount of LGBTQ related violent attacks, and also help reduce the amount of political factors that queer young people face that do harm their bodily and mental security and safety. So I know it's like a very big thing that's out of ASK's control, like they're not in charge of passing the anti-discrimination law, but I think as a pretty well-reputable NGO, I think they have power within public society to influence government in a way that is very powerful, I think. So that was our solution. Willing to field any other solutions that the participants may have as well, of course. Thank you.
Kit, did you say that in South Korea, homosexuality is criminalized or decriminalized? What did you say?
Decriminalized, sorry.
Decriminalized. Yes and no. Actually, yes in general, but in Korean military law, same-sex sexual intercourse is criminal. So yes and no.
So because that means there's a draft that's mandatory for all young men, I believe, right?
Yeah, all young men go to the army. And
so that means in effect it's illegal.
Yeah, in according to our military law. Okay. And that part of military law was pointed out by UN Human Rights Council a few times. So they recommended us to address it. It's discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Actually, they don't need that kind of law because according to our military law, all sexual intercourses in the army are prohibited. So why do they need to talk about same-sex, sexual activities when actually any sexual activity in the army is prohibited? So that's unnecessary regulation. But that's how it is, and a lot of human rights activists in South Korea think that we should change it.
I definitely agree with Ambassador Oh in the sense that a lot of countries, specifically Asian countries, have, even though if the LGBTQIA plus or homosexuality is decriminalized in the legal sense, there are laws that make it almost criminal. So it's both yes and no for a lot of countries. Like in India as well, homosexuality in itself is decriminalized. It's not a crime. But then again, same-sex marriages are prohibited or not allowed within the permits of the law. So that brings us to a huge debate of how, we have it decriminalized in one way or like looking at one sentence, but then there are like 3 or 4 clauses underneath that almost mean that even if you are, or even if it is decriminalized, there's only so much that you can do as a queer individual in countries like this. So it's very important to look into the laws more than just a huge banner of, let's say, it is criminalized or it is decriminalized. We need to look within the law to see how there is tinier policies that could be acting as a barrier for the exercising the rights for the LGBTQIA community.
I agree, and I think I just want to add to Vina's point. I think this is something that is in context of South Asia for sure, and I'm sure other countries can relate in a lot of sense. When it comes to the idea of queerness or LGBTQIA, Kit also brought this up about how people perceive, especially in the Asian context, this to be a very Western phenomena. However, it's actually like the history indicates that many of our countries actually had queerness in our communities. Like, example, the hijras in Bangladesh, the 5-gender community in Indonesia, and many more. So it's actually colonization that brought in this colonial laws of discrimination against homosexuality, and again, the practices in it as well. So I think it's also a matter of decolonizing queerness in the Asian context, or reclaiming queerness as a part of our history, as part of our culture. And I feel like that's another discourse that we could definitely have on, revisiting history from a decolonized perspective, because otherwise, a lot of the times, our very understanding is misguided by historical colonialism. I think that's really important to take into consideration, and I just wanted to add that as well. Before we go to the next one, I just wanted to again bring about one more particular observation that I've had in an international setting. So I think we all know what's happening in Iran, right? The protest in Iran by women of Iran for bodily rights to exercise the agency, and how that protest was being met by sanctioning by the government, which was very extreme, that led to the arrest of so many protesters, so many civilians, so many young women. And in this was a very chaotic situation. However, in the recent days, one can observe that the European Parliament has actually sanctioned against the Iranian officials. And this in itself is a really great act that could be done by international committees. The power of international communities and committees is often not often neglected. However, in such national stances, such civil disoriented courses where there's violation of rights of women and the minority or the marginalized communities, I think it's important to stand in solidarity and to be able to hold international committees and organizations accountable, or push them to act more, because their solidarity, their the act that they do, for example, the very one in the European Parliament in itself, also allows the local government, the local state, or the local authority in power to be more responsive, or to be more accountable. So, Kit, you wanted to add something to that?
Yes, I was just going to say that I completely agree, but I think it's also very much nuanced, because I think sanctions have very strong repercussions depending on what the sanctions are targeting on the civilian populations as well. And so if they are, sanctions against government or government officials or banking institutions, and then I think they are completely justified. But as you see with North Korea, for instance, a lot of the sanctions, or Cuba, for instance, a lot of the sanctions will affect the general population and prevent them from getting certain things. And so I think if we talk sanctions, there has to be a lot of nuance between government-related sanctions and sanctions that are all-encompassing and just make things worse for the people within the country and the context that they're living in. But absolutely, I agree.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Kit. Yes, definitely. That's so true. We need to be very much more articulate when it comes to even sanctioning, right? Because the effect of it could be different for different people. And so now, to follow up with this very conversation, I think if we could now look into the economic sector. So if Ritu and Muhammad could talk about the economic disenfranchisement of young people or youth.
Yes, thank you, Regita. The topic that we choose is economic disenfranchisement and victimization of young people. So just first going through the topic, the term that economic disenfranchisement, it really means that to be excluded from the process of creating or distributing wealth, the loss of access to unemployment, then credit, funding, the inability to trade or start a business, and so on. Nowadays, what we see that young people, they suffer disproportionately in labor markets in times of crisis. Example, the COVID pandemic. They are particularly vulnerable to layoffs, are more likely to even suffer declining wages, and then frequently are pushed into informal sector work with very poor pay and even the working conditions. And very few protective rights. Example, the migrant youth worker, they're suffering with that. So low quality of jobs, then high unemployment, racial discrimination. So all are the things that are victimizing the youth in terms of experiencing the economic disenfranchisement in the context in each parts of the world. So to advance the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, we definitely need to ensure the economic empowerment of youth first. As a recent global development, we have seen that particularly even in Africa and the Middle East, few international development organizations, they are working, like the CILATEC are trying to link youth with employment and giving them more employment opportunities. The reason is that they have understood that it is for their to safeguard youth against any kind of extremist ideologies, through enabling them to be involved into economic activities and to be economically empowered. So the reason that why we need to think about the economic disenfranchisement, the term, how we can relate with the youth. Economic inequities and disenfranchisement we have been observing in each part of the world, and the first thing that comes about the racial is that the racial exclusion, which led the young people to be the sufferers, victims of economic disenfranchisement. And still, unfortunately, even in this 21st century, racial inequalities still exist. The minority group, what we call as Black Americans, they are experiencing deep economic inequities at every level. And even in their income, they have drastically fewer assets than their counterparts. And even they have high rates of unemployment, less wealth, and have lower rates of home ownership. And even they have unequal access to the quality of life goods, education, health, and safety, which economic success is expected to guarantee. So those are the things that these disparities are the result of and are particularly reinforced by a host of rules, what we call is racial rules. Even we see, the case study shows that we see the economic disenfranchisement in Arab Spring youth. We know that the Arab Spring youth, that revolutions were largely caused by the realization of youth in Egypt, Libya, Syria, with the possibility of demanding access to jobs for all Arab youth. But the success of various states in that region in the longer term, that will depend on a strategy, on a coherent strategy that will assist the young Arabs to get the employment opportunities to become economically independent and empowered. But the reality says that in sub-Saharan Africa, economic growth has not translated into employment of large segments of the Middle East and North Africa population, particularly for the youths. And recent analysis that says that post-Arab Spring policies demonstrate that not being able to address one of the root causes of the Arab Spring, youth unemployment represents to return to a pre-Arab Spring situation. So that is the reason that failure to address this most fundamental right of a citizen, employment opportunities for the youth, could lay the groundwork for a new revolt, for a new protest. In the country of Bangladesh, the context that I'm living, the population of Rohingya refugees, that is increasing. And the youth, the refugee youth, that are increasing too. And the security concern is also increasing in the country. Even though there are organizations that are trying their hard to, through giving skills, building opportunities to women, to youth, but still a huge number of women and girls are being victims of human trafficking. And youth are engaged to drug smuggling, human trafficking, terrorism, as work opportunities are limited there. Within the camps, and even they have the lack of education and skills. As also there is no capital and there are restrictions on mobility beyond the camp. So even though Bangladesh is highly acclaimed for its generosity to give the space for those refugee people, but still the country does not have a national policy permitting refugees to work and have the limited resources as well. So those are the things that are causing economic disenfranchisement for those young youth refugees and excluding them to be involved into economic activities. So this is the common scenario worldwide. Now, the question comes up that why it is really needed to look into the issue. It is being emphasized that economic disenfranchisement, economic dynamism of youth that can lead to social peace, that can lead to political stability. On the other hand, the marginalization, the economic exclusion, all those things can not giving the opportunities to youth to be independent economically, that could lead a new revolt in the world. So, and even that could lead them to be involved into terrorism, radicalization. So we know that a country's focus is always to make the country secure, which is possible if we can empower those youth economically, regardless their ethnicity, race, background. But unfortunately, we rarely address the underlying causes till we face a big issue. Example, the protest in a country. So now it comes that what would be the solution for this issue? We have the UN, they have the goal 10 that specified that equal opportunity can be attained when discriminatory laws and practices are eliminated. However, the current legislative laws and policies do not showcase transparency to alleviate inequalities in some of the countries. And additionally, the opinions of the disadvantaged groups here do not translate in appropriate legislation to inform accountability in international economic and financial institutions. So things need to be changed accordingly. Besides, as each of the country has its own goal, they have their own vision and mission. And we think that for that, all of the groups, including the elite, common people, and particularly youth, all need to contribute to work on that. Even the United Nations strategy on youth, it prioritizes economic empowerment through decent work as their third priority to support young people's greater access to decent work and productive employment. And the most significant thing is that the political freedom, we need to give them the right of vote, example. So that could also be a significant solution for eliminating economic inequities for youth. So that's, I think, that what we can work on. And we would like to hear from your perspectives, what would be the solution? And that will be led by Mr. Muhammad. Over to you.
Thank you, Ritu, for your presentation. And thank you, everyone. My name is MD Sajid Hossain, and I have a questions to our Honorable Ambassador Joon Oh. Actually, my question is is it possible to eradicate a country's economic disenfranchisement only by political freedom, or that country, especially for developing or less developed countries, needs joint or individual help from the developed countries?
Yes, that is a good question. This nexus between development and human rights has been discussed for many years in many different contexts. Sometimes South Korea's experience is a good issue to discuss, because South Korea achieved both economic development and democratization during the last 30 years. So some people argue that, South Korea made impressive economic progress when the country had a dictator. So if you have a dictatorship, you can be more efficient. So you can focus on economic growth. So you can go for democratization after you reach a certain level of development, is their argument. But if that argument makes sense, then how come all other dictatorships in the world, they are not making any progress in economic development? So was it just a unique happening that happened in South Korea, or is there any correlation between economic growth and efficiency in governance, even if it's authoritarian? It's not easy to answer. You cannot go for experiment in other countries, so it's not easy. But in my opinion, what has happened in South Korea can happen in any other countries, but it does not mean that there is a kind of formula. If there is any formula and you can just do that in any other country, then you can have the same result. I don't think it works like that. So each country, each society has a different environment, different historical background. But we can reasonably be sure that, if you reach a certain level of development, economic development, then you necessarily should have social development as well. Social development includes gender equality, or, dealing with inequality issues, like Ritu pointed out, there are a lot of inequality issues. So if you reach a certain level of economic growth, you cannot go further without addressing these social issues. I think that's for sure. So if you have a political democratization, then it's much easier for you to address these social issues, because you can have a mechanism in which you can pool people's will, people's consensus, and then the society can have a lot of momentum and power to move on. For example, look at countries like China or Iran. We already talked about them. They might be making some progress in terms of economic development. Now, I think it's time for them to address social issues. Now it's time for them to address political freedoms, because in my opinion, you cannot move on further without addressing them.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your insights and for your opinion and everything. And my next question is we know that the marginalized refugees youth are high in numbers, and it's not possible to give the opportunity of employment for the country if it's the host country itself is a developing country. However, some organizations has also limited in terms of giving the group of enough employment opportunities, as they have barriers to go out of a certain space, for example, a camp area. What would be the solution for them actually? Then how can we reframe them being involved in illegal activities in terms of earning money or being economically independent?
Mohammed's question seems to be about migrant workers, right? Is it a fair understanding? Your question is focusing on migrant workers?
No, sir. Actually, I'm talking about the refugees. For example, yes, sir.
For example, what?
For example, they are residing in a country for the host country. If the host country is developing countries, then how we can involve them in the economic activities for their economic independence?
Well, that's a tough question, because when you talk about refugees, we assume that their status is not permanent. Nobody wants to remain a refugee for the rest of his or her life. So usually when you talk about refugees, their status is temporary, but we want to help them. We want to provide them with humanitarian assistance. But if they decide to settle, and if they want to work there, then it's another issue. Then it becomes an issue of migrant workers. But usually refugees, but some refugees, for example, from Syria go to European countries like Germany, advanced countries. Then they want to settle there. They want to get a job there, and they want to work there. Then it becomes an issue of immigration and migrant workers. But for example, Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, I don't know if they want to settle there. I don't know if they can get a job there. So their status is more temporary. So they want to have a day when they can go back to their country of origin, Myanmar. So refugees are not all different, but when you talk about refugees, opportunities to work and earn their living, then it issue becomes an issue of migrant workers. So we have a convention, UN Human Rights Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers. So they should be given fair treatment. They should be given equal opportunities, not least because, as I said in the beginning, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights.
I had actually another follow-up question to this. I think so when it comes to people with migrant status or refugee status, I'm sure it's more complicated to even answer because it's regional and there's a lot of complexities to it. However, I think in Ritu's presentation, we did uncover how within even a national context, based on your ethnicity, based on your social status, your economic status, all of that, there's a lot of discrimination, a lot of limitations that people in the lower hierarchy levels face, right? So there's a disproportionate impact of economic disenfranchisement on young people of different social identities. So in that sense, Ambassador, probably to everyone else here, I just wanted to know, how do you think we can empower young people, even within a country's perspective, and how can we mobilize them to be economically, empowered, especially in today's situation where economic crisis is a global problem, right? And we are still ongoing a major global economic crisis. So with this very unprecedented economic environment that we are in today, I think young people, including myself, we are very much, I think, lost or faced at what we can do and how we can, adapt to this changing environment. So if there's any way that maybe Ambassador, anyone else of you are trying to incorporate in your lives or trying to pass it on to the other young people around you that to help us, go through this economic crisis and maintain our empowered status economically.
I want to hear other participants' opinions first.
Thank you. I'd like to state a case from India where I've seen a lot of migrant workers around me, especially working in day-to-day life. And one problem or one specific concern that I noticed within them was also education, right? So education and integration in the economic life goes hand in hand because a lot of migrant workers or a lot of refugees still don't have access to education, or there are barriers to education for them that results in them having to take up manual working jobs or jobs that usually don't pay well or don't give an honorable status, right? So one thing that I think we could do or to help them would be to improve their access to education, higher education, to primary education, whatever. So at least they can equip themselves with skills and have a better understanding of the economic life and that will in turn help them get better opportunities in the economic sector as well. But also another thing that the Indian society follows for refugees that I've seen around me is that the government encourages them to practice a lot of handicraft or skill-based industries, get into that where they can pick up courses and then work in that area where they have their own unique skill. And the government has centers where they can equip themselves with these skills and gain like certificates for an year or have courses which enable them to take up this work. So both of these, I think, are methods that we could incorporate to improve their involvement in the economic sector.
Okay. Actually, regarding my country's situations, I have one more question to all of you and also for our honorable ambassador. So actually in our country, like there's a group of people we call like third gender. Actually, locally we call them Hijra. So they are like suffering for the gender identity, like gender stigma. Because of them, they cannot like engage in any kinds of economical activities in our country. But the number of this group is huge. I mean, like 500,000 people are like in this group. So my question is to all of you and to our honorable ambassador, like how we can include them in the social mainstream, like the mainstream of our society, especially for the economic empowerment of our country's development.
I think this kind of goes back into what Vinu and I focused on during our presentation in terms of social normalization and legalization of status. I think if you don't have status, it's really hard to do a lot of things like get education, get healthcare, get a variety of social services like we mentioned before that are connected with the government. And so I think one of the most important things for us to do in terms of increasing like participation or inclusivity of like the Hizra people in Bangladesh is advocating for their legalization of status, whether it's at the local level, whether it's at the national level, or even within certain institutions. I know, so like in France, for instance, there is a census that describes ethnicity. So this is a bit different, but I'll come back to how it's related. And within the census, they only declare whether or not you are French by citizenship or not French by citizenship. And there's no indication of country of origin or phenotype or racial or ethnic makeup. And so what that does is it prevents any sort of proper study to be done on how, different social minorities are being affected by different policies. You're either French or you're not French. And obviously, even if you're a French citizen, you can be, affected differently by different policies or lack of policies because of your social status. And so I think comparing that to Bangladesh is, seeing if there is any sort of policy like that, where like, are they included on census reports? Are they included on, NGO reports and kind of government institutions where there's a specific focus on how social policies, or again, lack of social policies directly affect these communities? Because the first thing that you have to deal with is statistics. If you don't know what issues they're facing, you can't address them. And again, that goes back into legalization of their identity as a community.
Yes.
I would also like to relate it with Valeria's and your point, the point of your presentation being political participation. So one way that I see that we can combat this issue in Bangladesh is by ensuring that there are more leaders from the community that needs help, and which will ensure that there is representation, and proper representation will also ensure that their issues and their concerns are brought into picture and they are addressed in a better way. So I think having representative leaders here could be a plausible solution.
Thank you so much, Vinu and Kit, and thank you everyone for your active contributions and input. So, Ambassador, would like to hand over to you for one last final note from you.
Thank you so much, Regita, and thank you so much, all the participants. I don't know if you have already read the Charter of the United Nations and Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I would strongly recommend you to read them, both of them. They are not terribly long. Universal Declaration of Human Rights is actually a few pages. You can read it in 10 minutes. So if you haven't, I would strongly encourage you to read them. Charter is not very long either. And you can find this expression again and again in both documents, which is we shouldn't have discrimination on the basis of sex, race, or religion. In 1940s, discrimination was mostly on the basis of sex, men and women, race, white or colored, and religion, Christianity or Muslims. But in today's world, we know that there are many other bases for discrimination. You guys already talked about LGBTQ, sexual orientation. We guys already talked about migrant issues, refugee issues, conflict victims, even COVID-19 victims. There are a lot of other bases for discrimination. And if you think about it, it's quite funny that we should worry more about discrimination compared to 1945. We are now living in the age of globalization. You can travel the world freely, not entirely freely, but in South Korea, when I was a student, we couldn't get a passport if we don't have a clear reason for travel, foreign trip. For example, if you are going to a foreign university, then you can have passport. If you are in business and your company is operating internationally, then you can have it. You cannot ask for a passport because you want to go for tourism in Turkey. There is no such reason as tourism for foreign trip. I don't know how it is in your own countries, but in these days, most countries, I think they can travel for tourism. They can travel for leisure. So we live in a world that is being globalized, which, logically speaking, should entail more global attitudes and global minds on the part of everyone. So that should bring us more equality, more freedom, not discrimination. Then how come we are talking about more reasons for discrimination today compared to 1945? Isn't it strange? Isn't it funny? I think what we need today is more global citizenship, which means that people need to think of themselves as a global citizen in addition to being a national citizen, which is not easy. Actually, as I said, because state governments are so powerful, they want to have control over us. Think about COVID-19. If they have good enough reasons, they want to prohibit or control travelers. They say that we are doing this in the interest of public health. But what about our freedoms? Our freedom to travel, our freedom to move? What about that? So, in a way, actually what we need is a global cooperation in the age of globalization, in the face of many mounting global challenges like climate crisis, pandemics, growing inequalities. All of these are global challenges that need to be addressed globally. A single nation cannot deal with this issue by itself. So we need global cooperation. But what we are witnessing is actually the opposite. Rising nationalism. Why? We need to think about why. So I want you guys to think about it. Is there something wrong with this institution called the state? State sovereignty. Why do states have sovereignty? Sovereign power. Sovereign power, what does it mean? It means that highest power. States have highest power within their territory. Since 17th century, when they had Westphalia Treaty in Europe. So we assume that states should have highest power. We assume that all states are equal because they have highest power, all of them. So this assumption might not be right for the future of the global community because we are living in the age of globalization and you cannot reverse it. We can fly from Korea to Singapore and Paris within a day. So if you don't like it, you can stop traveling, but you cannot reverse it. If you prefer slow airplane, nobody's going to introduce it for you. So we are living in the age of globalization, which is irreversible. And then our mindset should be more global, but in reality, it is not. So this is a big challenge, especially for you, because you are the next generation. My generation is, is getting over. So the world will be upon your shoulders. And if my generation, we are so focused on fighting, competing between nations, we don't think much about the future of humanity, the future of Earth, then all the burdens of addressing climate crisis, addressing growing inequalities, addressing refugee issues, addressing pandemic, all this burden goes to you, which is very sad in my opinion, but that's one of the reasons why we should have discussions like this more often, and we should encourage more people to think about it and to act. Thank you.
Yes, and with that, we are at the end of our session. Thank you so much, Ambassador. That was like a perfect way to end the session. Definitely, again, makes us all reflect a bit more about our roles, our responsibilities, and what we can do to create the future that we want to have.